Hello everyone, welcome to Scorcher Toys at AnyMoon.com's review of Sentinel's Riobot 112 scale ride armor toys. Specifically, we are looking at the VR-52F stick version released in April 2018 for 20,000 yen and the VR-52T Ray version released in May 2018 also for 20,000 yen. These toys come in lovely boxes adorned by art from Mercy Rabbit. You may recognize that name from the Mospita Complete Artworks book released a while back. There was some art from Mercy Rabbit in there. Inside the lovely box, you will find the goodies, including 3 pairs of fixed posed hands, a helmetless head for the rider. You obviously get the rider and the bike. With the stick version, you also get the big gun that is often seen with Stick's VR-52F. Behind the tray, you get a display stand, which includes a base and an arm, and also a claw, which we'll look at more closely in just a moment here. And of course, behind all that, you also get instructions. For Ray's version, you get all of the same stuff except the gun, which I thought was quite a big bummer since this particular toy draws its inspiration from the Mospita Complete Artworks book I mentioned before, which shows a big bazooka with Ray, so it would have been cool if they included that. But failing that, you would think they'd at least throw in a gallant gun like we saw in the show. Usually this is the point in the review where I tell you to shop at Big Bad Toy Store. They do have a great collection of pretty much everything, but they will not have this toy as it's sold out everywhere. So if you were waiting for a review to make your decision, I'm afraid you've waited too long. You still might want to keep an eye on their listing, as some might free up once their shipment arrives. Of course, I'm providing a click-through link in the comments section. You help me out and help the channel out when you do your shopping that way. Since I had the toys on the display stand on the turntable, I'm going to start with the display stand, and that's going to give me the ability to show you a couple other features and probably a couple annoying things about these toys right off the bat. If you're going to use the display stand in bike mode, you're probably just going to peg in to the bottom of the bike. It's a pretty secure pegging, so you don't have to worry about that bike going anywhere. Now, if you want to take your bike off the display stand, there's a neat little kickstand underneath the toy, and we're just going to fish that out, and it pivots. So here it comes down and it pivots. It only rotates one side, and you can kind of adjust where you've got it to make sure it is standing in the position that you want it at, which is pretty cool. So there we go. We've got no display stand. Bike is standing on its own, no problem. One complaint, since we're starting with complaints as well, the ball joint on the head seems to be really loose on my Ray toy. But what I wanted to show you there was that you can bring his head up quite a bit to get a pretty natural riding position. So that's pretty cool. Another feature we have while we're talking about the bikes is the ability to stow Stick's big gun on the side of the bike. And to do that, the handle collapses and the little shoulder mount can pivot up and down. So that's pretty cool stuff there. And again, just pegs in right like so. And again, we can remove him off the peg. Now, in doing so, I moved his foot, which caused the little above the foot guard to pop off. There's a teeny tiny ball joint. It is very common that this piece will pop off on you, and it can be quite annoying. But I want to talk about the display stands here. So here is the display stand. If you are familiar with Sentinel toys, you may have seen this display stand before. It's just a basic arm. It bends more in one direction than the other, and you can use that to your benefit or detriment. Hopefully more to your benefit. Obviously this pivots and it swings around. So that's what you can do with the display stand. The connector to the bottom goes in these little slots here, and you have a lot of optionality where you want to put it. And it stays very securely in place. So that's all good. You also get a claw. So if you are in armor mode, which we'll see later, you could just use this as a support on the back. That would be less obvious. Taking a closer look at the motorcycle now, it does have rubber wheels that spin, and you can have the feet elevated enough so they're not dragging on the ground if that was a concern of yours. There are foot pegs that flip out, which is pretty cool. Translucent plastic bits in the tail lights, the blinkers, the headlights, obviously the windscreen. All of that's good. It handles bike mode really well. The only thing that occasionally comes askew, like right on time there, are these front gauntlets. When you're handling them, you can bump them kind of outward and they will pop free. I did find that the front gauntlets on the VR-52F look a little large for my tastes. They obviously extend out quite a bit. This is part of the redesign of the Mospeada, the sort of modern interpretation of it. From the side, people have complained that it looks pretty gappy. Let's take a look at one without the rider figure on it here. Sort of strangely enough, Ray's, which has that big gun on the side, has a much smaller interpretation of the gun than I would have expected when I saw those missiles being so big on sticks. Again, some people might like that, some people might not. There's the gappiness. I'm thinking futuristic mechanics, could be a whole bunch of different shapes, so I'm not going to hold it too much against the toy. The lack of gauge detail is a bummer to me. There's no sticker either to kind of make up for that. Not that I really use stickers, but something to consider. There is a bit of a cool gimmick here. There is a HBT canister. You can pop open these little hinges and then push that through. And it's got a little groove in it to make sure you put it back in the right way. Now, oddly enough, there's no hand that really takes advantage of this removable canister. You would think that they'd give you a hand-holding canister, but they don't really do that. So, bike mode, solid, looks good, and considering how fidgety the rider figure is, the bike itself is a highlight. Any conversation about the figures should begin with the new helmet design, which does have these lines on it. That's true to the design as drawn, but it's pretty divisive. And you'll also notice it's completely opaque. You can't see the nice figurehead underneath. So that's a bit of a bummer. So a lot of people haven't been happy with that and have been customizing this to get rid of those lines and make the helmet translucent, which is something, you know, I personally wish Sentinel had done from the onset. You can see new shape. I'm going to do a little bit more comparing this design to the old designs in just a moment here, but let's continue focusing on the figure. As we move down a little bit, we have some fixed posed hands that come with this toy. You just pop off the existing hand. It's just a ball joint and pop the new hand on. It's a little difficult because that's a fairly small cavity with a ball joint on both ends. So it can be a little tricky to get these new fists on in a way that's going to work. And of course, there it is fighting me a little bit. So there you go. Now, once you do have your figure as you want him, articulation is fantastic. You do have a torso that kind of comes back and forward, a twist at the torso. Now this is obviously, this is a ball joint in there. And once again, you can pop that ball joint free. That's sort of a blessing and a curse with this toy, is a ton of ball joints, which means a ton of things that can pop free on you. So the head is a ball joint. We've already discussed it. This one comes off a little easier than I wanted. I said it was loose, but it's actually just, it doesn't fit quite right. It's stiff enough, but it pops off easily. So the other head here, we can pop that on, and there you go. Good look there. Good articulation to it again, it'll pop off on me. The shoulders have an up and down feature, and that comes in handy also when reaching for the bike handles. There's a twist point and a nice elbow here. And obviously the double ball jointed hands gives you some articulation there. Now, there's also a neck joint underneath the head. So again, all of this comes together to give you incredibly lifelike poses. Down at the bottom near the waist, let's come back a little further on the camera here. Down at the waist, you also have another point of articulation, a little back and forth there. You have the hips that come way out, come forward and back, and twist right at that armor piece. You have the knee, which is double jointed. You can see there's some fabric here. We're going to talk about the fabric a little bit more in a moment too. The feet are exceptionally well articulated. They're very stiff out of the box, but they do have this back and forth and the forward and back with a toe. And again, you have these pieces here, which are on ball joints that come off a little too freely. All of this comes together in a way that allows you to make some great poses and really enjoy the look of your figures in your display case. Now, it's unfortunate that things pop free a little easily, but as you've seen me handle it, it hasn't been too brutal. The stick, on the other hand, these pieces, it's pretty much anytime I move the foot are popping off. And I've got a loose piece here, just, it's a glue issue, so that's unfortunate. So that's, you know, these pieces popping off obviously can be frustrating and make it more of a display piece than a real fun toy to handle. Another unfortunate thing I have is it looks like Ray split his pants. It's pretty hard to notice, obviously, it's not bugging me too much, but in the future, if that becomes a big rip, that could be pretty unfortunate. So let's hope that's not the case. This is hardly the first ride armor toy. Here we have the 110 Gakken that kind of started everything off. You could see it's not the most realistic looking compared to our modern competition. Face is kind of haunting without eyes, and it's got gigantic boots on, but hey man, it's still a really cool toy from the 80s if you could find one. Then we have our 110 scale Beagle toy, which is still the top of the line as far as the original ride armor design goes. Now you can see the old Beagle toys at this point, the stick version in particular, they had improved by the Ray version. The fabric on them falls apart. There's some sort of a foam layer that they put it above the actual fabric, and it just dries out and flakes off and tears if you try to rotate anything. So there you can see it's splitting. So not great quality in that regard, but otherwise the Beagle absolutely fab-boo in its old school interpretation. Here we have the modern ride armor, which again has a re-envisioning of the old classic. You can see there is no fabric anymore on the abdomen, which is cool. I mean, if I had my druthers, there'd be no fabric on this toy whatsoever. It looks like a modern version of the suit, and that's pretty cool. If we go along, we have our old Mega House and CM's toys. And honestly, these are tier 2 toys. If everything else I've just mentioned was tier 1. Their interpretation has a lot of concessions it makes. The Mega House, I mean, just looking at the figure itself, you could see not the most human looking figure. The CM's toy, very small, so a lot of compromises related to that. So if you're looking for top of the line ride armor figures, it's really going to come down to Beagle for that classic look, and now the Sentinel for this re-envisioned version. I still love my 110 scale Gakken. Sure, the rider can't actually ride the bike, but its 80s chunkiness in all of its glory, it transforms, it's cool. I'm happy to have one in my collection, and I think if you're a Mospeada fan, you should have one in your collection. The Beagle is definitely the super deluxe version of the ride armor you know from the show. It's got a removable HBT canister similar to the Sentinel. It has some issues. The windscreen is easily budged. The gauntlets are pretty easily budged. The tail here, easily budged. It does have foot pegs that swing out. It has a kickstand. It's even got coilover suspension. The details obviously are top notch. You've got those nice headlights in the front. So if you are a die-hard, has to look like the anime guy, this is the toy for you. Also rubber wheels that roll. But it's incredibly complicated. The transformation guide is something like 84 steps. So you are going to have to put aside like an hour of time if you want to go from bike to rider mode. And as you can see, it kind of gets jostled fairly easily. It's fairly high maintenance. And with the stick figures cloth falling apart on you. The VR-52F might not be the most desirable anymore. You might want to go with the Ray version. Then we have the Sentinel version here. You've seen all the pluses of it. It's a little bit more user-friendly to handle than the Sentinel. You've got this redesign, a totally new look, which might be more appealing to you or less. And it holds together really well and makes a fantastic display piece. So let's go ahead and continue on. Let's transform these things. On our way to armor mode, this is a compact version of the ride armor, what it might look like when Stick was lugging it out of his Legios. One cool thing about the new design is that the gauntlets have these gaps in them, which lines up pretty well with the hip armor gap or protrusion. So that kind of syncs up and gets you this nice tight look. You could then take your display stand, and obviously Stick can do a good crouching over pose there. Take your display stand and peg it in on the bottom, which it takes quite a bit of force to get this peg in there. So let's get that in there. And once that's in there, now there is a loose joint that is a little problematic for me when I don't have the toy all together, but I could bring the hip armors down and have the gauntlets down and do kind of a just the armor by itself look. Obviously I would fine tune that a bit, and then I could do some cool stuff with Stick standing right next to his armor. So that opens up some cool display possibilities. There are a couple other ride armor toys that do this. Actually, the Beagle can do this. The CM's toy can almost do this. The gauntlets aren't connected, but otherwise it gets pretty close. Something like the classic Gakin toys, the Mega House toys, you can't pull this off. The ability to stow the armor in between modes is pretty cool because it shows you that the company involved is taking the idea of the powered suit very seriously. And when you get to armored mode, you see that in spades. Now, first of all, you can see I had the toy standing on its own. The display stand isn't necessary, but it's going to be highly recommended because you do have the preponderance of the weight over the back of the toy. But looking at the actual toy itself, here's the swing arm that connects to the hip armor that connects down to the knee. And then you have the strut in the back that comes forward and connects to the gauntlet. So everything is connected and would give the rider the superhuman abilities that you see in this show. Unlike something like the Gakin, the CMs, or the Mega House where pieces pop off, get put back on, and there's no direct connection there. So this is one of those toys with the Beagle that really pulls off that suit, that powered suit feel and look. The downside to that is that you end up with a whole lot of pieces that are connected. So anytime you want to move something, you have to move a whole lot of other stuff with it. So if I wanted to move the arm into a different position, you could see my strut is now going to hit my shoulder. So what I'd want to do is pivot this piece out and then bring the arm up. What ends up happening with stuff like that is you end up disconnecting ball joints because you don't get it perfect the first time. So handling this toy can be very frustrating in that regard. What's better to think of it conceptually is if you pick a pose you want to accomplish, you then either pop off the gauntlets and the hip armors, get the underlying rider figure where you want him, and then you figure out how to get everything reconnected again with that new pose that you've chosen. So it's not that you're just going to take the toy, totally move him around into a completely different pose, and it's just going to work. Chances are something's got to pop off and get positioned back into place. So handling the toy, not quite as dreamy as you might have hoped. Now, still, same riding figure underneath there, same, articulation there. So it's really about figuring out how everything can pivot so you can take the most of it, and you can still pull off some very dynamic, very cool poses. Now here we have Stick firing his missiles. You could also see that there's these side vents for the boosters, which is pretty cool. They open up. Now what you don't get with this toy is the little pop-out scope that Stick used in the show. Again, this is a new interpretation of the ride armor. You could see you've got those lines on the helmet, so the assumption would be Stick is now using a heads-up display within his helmet. So to drive that point home a little further, here is the toy standing up on its own. I have removed this gauntlet, and I want to show you the pieces involved here. So here's the ball joint that's going to connect interior just before that wheel there. It has a rotation point there, but it's incredibly stiff. So if I want to move the toy right now, what's more likely is that the ball joint's going to pop out rather than that arm twisting. Also, it goes up and down on this piston, but it's incredibly stiff there too. So as you move the toy, instead of that piston moving, the ball joint will pop out. So then you would go ahead, get it to about where you think it is, pop it back in, and then it should work out for you. Now, as we continue down, there is this pivot point here, which also rotates. And then you have a pivot point where it reaches the actual gauntlet, which also gives you a little bit of twist as well. So you have a whole bunch of different dynamic bits here, all of them very stiff. So if you just wanted to grab the arm and move it and have it do something new, chances are not all of those joints are going to move the way they would need to. They aren't going to move fluidly. So instead, a ball joint might pop off, and then you'd have to get it where you think it belongs and then pop it back in the toy. You know, always a pretty simple matter to pop a ball joint back in. So there that goes. And then you just line it back up, get your pegs in the right spot, and you should be able to just tab in the part. And then hopefully, if you've lined everything up, which I really didn't do, it was kind of careless with it, but it should just peg into place and then stay there for you. So there you go. That's kind of how handling this toy goes. And you can see I did lose my little shin guard or foot guard in doing that. Just plug that back in, and there you go. Look, Mom, none are falling over, and I'm not using the display stands. Yay! I've got the Gakken 110 scale over here. It's a little more than 21 centimeters tall. It does have big metal arms that bring the wheels up into place. The Sentinel is about 17.5 centimeters long and has almost no metal in it. So if you're someone that really matters to, you want the sentimental vibe from your old Gakken, you're not getting that here. The CM's toy has those same metal arms too. Obviously much smaller, 11.5-ish centimeters. Kind of cool it pulls off what it does in such a tiny package, but if you want to talk fiddly, this is bringing it to a whole nother level than we are seeing with the Sentinel here. Otherwise, obviously not nearly as chunky, and you can see lots of different elements from the redesign, like the mud guard, a whole new different aesthetic to it, which is really cool. So let's pull out a Beagle and see how it looks. So here is the Beagle and the Sentinel. The Beagle, obviously 110 scale, a little bit larger than the Riobot. It's more like a little bit more than 20 centimeters tall. It has the same cool feature on the Ray version where the gun pops out from the gauntlet and then goes into the hand, which is pretty cool to see. And so I think the question in most people's minds is going to be, is the Riobot a replacement for the Beagle? And my answer to that would be Sentinel was very intelligent not to use the classic designs on their toys. Instead, they used this new modern interpretation, because if they look just like the Beagle, which has balance problems all of its own, but still can stand. But if they look just like the Beagle, then it would be hard to tell you what the value add is to the Riobot besides being a slightly smaller scale. And it's a slightly simpler toy as well. The Beagle definitely very complicated to handle. So that's where the Riobot shines. It's a little simpler, it's a little smaller, and it's got this new aesthetic which differentiates it enough to make it a worthwhile addition if you already have some Beagle toys. If it looked just like the Beagle and you had the Beagle already, then why would you bother, right? So it doesn't dethrone the Beagle in my mind as the best ride armor toy ever. I like the classic look. That's what I grew up with. That's what I wanted a toy of, and I got it, so I'm really stoked on that. Really bummed Beagle never finished the line. Really bummed that the Beagle stick figures have cloth issues. I will address that in another video. I'm super stoked that we have the new versions. I really hope that it leads to further toys. We get Houquet and Yellow, and I think that a lot of people would enjoy adding this toy to their collection. Now the problem, of course, is it's a complicated toy, even if it's simpler than the Beagle. It's difficult to handle. You do, like I said, you have to kind of pick your pose and then get it to work. And it's transformation. It takes a motorcycle, puts it into its core components, and then straps it back onto a rider figure. So people are going to say that looks fiddly, and it really is. But it's hard to imagine that whole situation happening in a figure that wouldn't be considered fiddly in some way. So there it is. Check out anymoon.com for my full article. And as always, thanks for watching.